The auctioneer's voice was a gravelly rhythm under the hot July sun of 76, a rhythmic chant that separated men from their money. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything. The sweat on my neck, the cracked vinyl of the folding chairs, the once proud paint on a row of tired farm equipment. I stood at the back, leaning against the fender of a stranger's pickup, my arms crossed. A man with nothing to sell and less to buy has no business at an auction, but I was drawn there by the ghosts of my own past. Just a year prior, it was my family's name on the sale bill, my father's tractors under the hammer. The auctioneer, a man named Miller, who could talk a bird out of its feathers, was working his way down the line of junk. A bent disc harrow that went for scrap price, a New Holland hay rake with half its teeth missing. Then he stopped at the last piece, a machine so forlorn it looked like it had been pulled from a riverbed. "All right, boys, what we have here is a classic," Miller boomed, slapping a rusted sheet of metal that rang with a dull thud. "A Massey Ferguson 300. She was a revolutionary machine in her day, a real grain-getter." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. The combine was a monument to neglect. Its red paint was faded to a blotchy pink, streaked with years of rust that bled from every bolt and seam. The tires were cracked and flat, sinking into the soft dirt. The auger was bent at a sad angle, and a bird's nest was tucked inside the hollow of the reel. The glass in the cab was shattered on one side, a spiderweb of despair. "She ain't run in a decade, they tell me," Miller admitted, his showmanship unwavering. "Engines locked up tighter than a banker's wallet. But for the man with the time and the know-how, there's good iron here. We're selling it for scrap, boys, where she sits. Let's start the bidding at $200. Who'll give me $2? Silence. The only sound was the wind whispering through the cornfields that bordered the auction yard. $200 was the price of a decent load of scrap steel, and it would take a cutting torch and a week's work to get this thing into sellable pieces. Then, a voice cut through the quiet, slick with arrogance. "You'd have to pay me $200 just to haul that piece of junk away, Miller." It was Richard Sterling. He was leaning against his brand-new Ford F-250 Ranger, all chrome and candy apple red. Sterling was young, maybe 30, with soft hands and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. While the rest of us were tightening our belts, he was expanding, buying up land with bank money, financing the newest, biggest equipment. He'd just taken delivery of a John Deere 7700 combine, a green monster that looked like it belonged on another planet compared to the tired Massey. He saw farming not as a way of life, but as a numbers game played with other people's money. The crowd laughed along with him. Sterling had a way of making you feel like you were in on the joke, even when the joke was on you. "Come on now, Rich," Miller played along. "A little respect for your elders. This machine put a lot of food on the table." "Its time has come and gone," Sterling said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is the age of horsepower and hydraulics, not rust and regret. Get big or get out." He looked around, his gaze sweeping over the faces of men whose families had farmed this land for 100 years, men he was slowly buying out, one over-leveraged note at a time. His eyes met mine for a second, a flicker of pity mixed with contempt. He knew my story. Everyone did. Jed Stone, the man who'd lost the Stone family century farm. Miller tried again. "Do I hear 100? $50? Someone give me a bid before I send her to the scrap yard." My hand went up. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a reflex, a muscle memory from a time when I was a man of substance, a man who bought things. But the motion was timid, just a slight raise of 2 fingers. Miller's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, locked onto me. "I've got a bid from Jed Stone. I've got $50. Who'll give me 60? 60? The crowd turned to look at me. The murmuring started. What's he doing? He ain't got 2 nickels to rub together. Lost his damn mind. Sterling just shook his head and chuckled, a dismissive, pitying sound. $50 once, Miller called. 50 twice. 500, I said. My voice was hoarse, louder than I intended. The words hung in the hot, still air. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $500 was my entire world. It was the last of the cash I had tucked away, the sum total of my severance from the life I once knew. It was grocery money, rent money, survival money, and I had just thrown it at a dead machine. Sterling looked at me, his smirk gone, replaced by genuine disbelief. He saw it not as a bid, but as an act of lunacy. He opened his mouth to say something, then just shook his head and turned away, as if I wasn't worth the effort. Sold. Miller's gavel, a worn piece of oak, cracked down on his podium. To Jedediah Stone for $500. Son, I hope you know what you're doing. I didn't. All I knew was that I couldn't stand there and watch that old combine get cut up for scrap. It was forgotten, written off, left for dead. I knew the feeling. As I walked up to the clerk's table to hand over a wad of worn bills, I could feel the weight of every eye on my back. I had just bought myself a 10-ton anchor, a public declaration of my own failure. Getting it home was an ordeal in itself. I had to pay a neighbor with a lowboy trailer $20. I didn't have to haul it the 5 miles to the small acreage I was renting. The place was nothing more than 100 acres of marginal ground with a sway-backed barn and a tiny farmhouse that leaked when it rained. We winched the Massey off the trailer, and it settled into the weeds beside the barn with a groan of stressed metal, looking even worse than it had at the auction. For 3 days, I just looked at it. I walked around it, tracing the rust patterns with my fingers, peering into the darkened engine bay. The heart of the machine was a Perkins 6.344, a 6-cylinder diesel that was legendary in its day for being tough as nails. This one, however, was seized solid. The starter wouldn't even budge it. Rain had gotten down the unsheltered exhaust stack, a fatal mistake. Now, before I tell you how I planned to get that seized Perkins turning over again, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever bought a piece of old iron that everyone else called junk, knowing you could bring it back to life? Maybe it was a Farmall M your granddad left in the fence row, or an old Ford 8N you found in a barn. Let me know in the comments what it was, and how you brought it back from the dead. Because what I had to do next, well, it was a battle of wills between me and that lump of frozen iron. My workshop was the dirt floor of that old barn, lit by a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed wire. My tools were my father's, heavy, American-made wrenches and sockets that wore the scars of 100 repairs. They felt right in my hands, a connection to a man who believed you didn't own a machine until you'd had it apart and put it back together again. The first step was to get inside the engine's guts. I started with the injector lines, carefully loosening the fittings with a flare nut wrench, tagging each one with a piece of masking tape. Then came the valve cover, held on by a half-dozen bolts. When I lifted it off, the sight wasn't pretty. A milky, brownish sludge coated the rocker arms, a telltale sign of water in the oil. This was worse than I thought. The cylinder head was next. The head bolts on a diesel are torqued down to incredible pressures. I put a 4-foot cheetah pipe on my biggest breaker bar and leaned into it with all my weight. The first bolt let out a groan that sounded like a dying animal before it broke loose. One by one, I worked my way through them, my muscles screaming in protest. Finally, with the help of a chain hoist slung over a barn beam, I lifted the heavy cast-iron head off the block. The sight that greeted me made my stomach sink. The tops of all 6 pistons were covered in a crust of rust. The cylinder walls, where they were visible above the pistons, were streaked with it. Number 4 and 5 cylinders were the worst. They must have been at the bottom of their stroke when the engine last stopped, allowing pools of rainwater to sit for years. It had become a chemical weld, fusing the cast-iron piston rings to the steel cylinder sleeves. I spent the next week trying every trick my father had ever taught me. I poured penetrating oil into the cylinders, letting it soak. I tried a mixture of automatic transmission fluid and acetone, a concoction the old-timers swore by. Nothing. That engine was locked solid. News of my folly spread through the county like a thistle seed on the wind. The morning coffee drinkers at the diner in town had made it their favorite topic. Heard Jed Stones trying to resurrect that old Massey. More like trying to resurrect his pride. He ought to just get a job driving a truck. Richard Sterling was a regular at that diner. He'd drive by my place on his way into town, slowing his shiny Ford down just enough to make sure I saw him. He'd shake his head, a look of theatrical pity on his face, before speeding off in a cloud of dust. He was building his empire on $60,000 loans and $100,000 combines, and I was out here with a set of hand tools and a $500 boat anchor. I was a relic, a living fossil, and he was the future. The scorn was a physical thing. It felt like a weight on my shoulders every time I went to the co-op for a can of oil or a handful of bolts. The whispers would stop when I walked in. The clerk would be polite, but distant. I was no longer one of them. I was the guy who lost his farm, the guy wasting his life on a pile of junk. After 2 weeks of soaking the cylinders with no results, I knew I had to resort to brute force. But it had to be controlled force. A sledgehammer would just crack the pistons or, worse, the block itself. I needed to push, not strike. I went to the old lumber pile behind the barn and found a solid block of oak, a leftover from some long-forgotten project. I cut it on my father's old table saw until it was just slightly smaller than the diameter of the cylinder sleeve. Then I rigged up a contraption that would have made my high school physics teacher proud. I placed a 20-ton hydraulic bottle jack on a thick steel plate that I laid across the top of the engine block. I positioned the oak block on top of the number 4 piston and placed the jack on top of that, centered perfectly. The top of the jack pressed against one of the heavy overhead beams of the barn. I took a breath and started pumping the handle of the jack. The pressure built slowly. The steel plate bowed slightly. The barn beam groaned under the strain. I could hear the creak of wood, the ping of metal under tension. Nothing happened. The piston didn't move a fraction of an inch. I released the pressure and went to the next cylinder, then the next, trying each one. They were all frozen solid. Defeat felt cold and heavy in my gut. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just a pile of junk. I sat down on an overturned bucket, the smell of rust and old oil filling my lungs, and buried my face in my greasy hands. The silence of the barn was deafening. But then I remembered something my father used to say. Metal has a memory, son. You just have to know how to talk to it. He believed that heat and vibration could break bonds that sheer force couldn't. The next morning, I was back at it with a new plan. I applied pressure to the number 4 piston again with the jack, just enough to put the whole assembly under a heavy strain. Then I took my propane torch, the kind you use for sweating copper pipes, and began to heat the outside of the engine block around the cylinder. I didn't want to get it red hot, just hot enough to make the cast iron block expand. Metal expands when heated. and my hope was that the block would expand just a few thousandths of an inch more than the piston inside it. After 10 minutes of careful heating, I picked up a small ball-peen hammer and a brass drift. I placed the drift against the side of the piston, near the edge, and gave it a sharp, solid rap with the hammer. There was a crack, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet barn. For a heart-stopping second, I thought I'd cracked the block. But then I looked at the pressure gauge on the jack. It had dropped. The piston had moved. It was only a fraction of an inch, a movement so small you could barely see it, but it had broken free. A wave of triumph washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. I had a foothold. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I knew I could win. It took another 2 weeks of this painstaking process, heat, pressure, shock, to free all 6 pistons. I'd push them down an inch, release the jack, rotate the crankshaft a little with a long bar on the front pulley, and start all over again. Each one came out with a final, gritty screech of protest, revealing cylinder walls that were badly scored and pitted. The work was just beginning. The early 1970s bled into the middle of the decade, and something strange started to happen in the heartland. The price of corn, which had hovered around $1 a bushel for as long as anyone could remember, started to climb. $1.50, $2, then it shot past $3. A grain deal with the Soviet Union had opened the floodgates. Suddenly, there was more money in farming than anyone had ever seen. Land prices, which had been stable for a generation, doubled, and then doubled again. The era of optimism had arrived, and no one rode that wave higher than Richard Sterling. He became the golden boy of the county. The bank loved him. He used his rapidly appreciating land as collateral to borrow more and more money, buying up every parcel that came for sale. He traded in his 2-year-old John Deere 7700 for a brand-new International Harvester 1480, axial flow, a machine that could cut twice as much in a day. He bought a monstrous 4-wheel drive Steiger Panther tractor to pull a 24-row planter. His operation was a gleaming, modern marvel of horsepower and debt. At the diner, he'd hold court, explaining his philosophy to the older farmers who were still driving their patched-up Farmall M's and John Deere 4020s. "You can't be scared of debt," he'd say, stirring cream into his coffee. "It's a tool just like a wrench. You use it to build something bigger. Land is the only thing they're not making more of. You got to buy it when you can, at any price." The old-timers would nod, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. Sterling's logic seemed intoxicating, undeniable. The numbers worked. With corn at $3 a bushel, you could make the payments on those massive loans and still have plenty left over. He was a prophet of prosperity. Meanwhile, my world remained small and quiet. After freeing the pistons, I had spent an entire winter rebuilding that Perkins diesel. I honed the cylinder sleeves by hand with a drill-mounted hone, cleaning up the worst of the rust and scoring. I found a set of oversized rings at a salvage yard and painstakingly filed them to fit. I ground the valves, replaced the seals, and put it all back together with a new set of gaskets I'd had to order from a specialty supplier in Des Moines. The day I finally got it running was a day I'll never forget. I'd bled the fuel system, primed the oil pump, and hooked up a battery from my old pickup. I turned the key, and the starter, which I'd also rebuilt, groaned as it turned the heavy engine over. It coughed once, twice, then erupted to life in a thick cloud of blue and black smoke. The clatter of the 6-cylinder diesel echoed off the barn walls, a sound of pure, mechanical resurrection. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The rest of the combine took another year. I had to learn to weld to patch the holes in the grain tank. I spent weeks splicing and replacing the dry, rotted hydraulic lines and wiring. I rebuilt the variable speed drive, fabricating new bushings on my father's old metal lathe. I replaced every bearing, every belt. I did it all myself, paying for parts with the meager income I earned from selling hay off my rented 100 acres. By the harvest of 78, the Massey Ferguson 300 was ready. It wasn't pretty. The paint was a patchwork of red primer and faded original Massey red. The cab was still missing a pane of glass, but mechanically it was sound. It was mine, and it was paid for. I started doing custom work for some of the smaller farmers in the area, the ones who couldn't afford Sterling's high rates or couldn't get on his busy schedule. I cut 80 acres of oats for Old Man Hemphill. I combined 120 acres of soybeans for the Miller brothers down the road. My rates were low, but my costs were lower. My only major expense was diesel fuel. I didn't have a loan payment. I didn't have a note at the bank. Still, in the eyes of the community, I was a failure. They saw Sterling parking a brand new $50,000 tractor in his shed, and they saw me crawling under my 20-year-old combine with a grease gun. They saw him buying the farm next door, and they saw me living in a rented shack. My caution was seen as cowardice. My discipline was interpreted as a lack of ambition. I was Jed Stone, the man who tinkered with junk while the world passed him by. One afternoon in the fall of 79, I was at the co-op, waiting for the manager to ring up a new oil filter for the Massey. I was going to pay for it with the crumpled bills in my pocket. Richard Sterling was there, standing at the counter next to me, his checkbook open. He was signing for his fall operating loan, a figure with so many zeros on it, it made my head spin. He was laughing with the loan officer, talking about the new grain dryer he was putting in. The manager's phone rang, and he picked it up. His side of the conversation was short, but I caught a few words that sent a chill down my spine. The prime rate went up again? To what? Volker's not kidding around, is he? Sterling didn't seem to notice. He was on top of the world. Grain prices were still high, land was still climbing, and the bank was still willing to lend. He clapped the loan officer on the back, tore off his copy of the loan agreement, and walked out without so much as a glance in my direction. I paid for my filter, $4.72, cash, and walked out into the cool autumn air. I looked at Sterling's new truck speeding away, and then I looked at my own hands, calloused and stained with grease. A knot of unease was tightening in my stomach. The whole world felt drunk on cheap money and high grain prices, but I could hear a distant rumble, a change in the weather. These good times felt brittle, stretched thin, like a wire about to snap. I drove my old Ford pickup home, the setting sun glinting off the Massey 300, which sat in my yard like a silent, steel sentinel, waiting. It owed no man a thing. And in that moment, I had a feeling that was going to matter more than anything else. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap, but a whisper. It was the summer of 1980, and the sky turned a hard, unforgiving blue. For weeks, the sun beat down, baking the black Iowa soil into a cracked grey plate. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high by the 4th of July, was stunted and pale, its leaves rolling up tight like cigars to conserve every drop of moisture. The air was thick with the smell of hot dust and withered hopes. The drought was only the beginning. The real storm was brewing in panelled boardrooms and marble halls far to the east. The whispers I'd heard at the co-op about Paul Volcker and the prime rate had become a roar. Interest rates, once a manageable single digit, began a relentless, terrifying climb. 10%, 12, 15. Every tick upwards was like another turn of a thumbscrew on the farmers who had borrowed heavily during the boom years. Richard Sterling, for the first time, looked worried. The easy confidence was gone from his eyes, replaced by a pinched, hunted look. He drove his equipment harder than ever, trying to squeeze every last bushel out of the parched earth. His new International Harvester, 1480 combine, ran from dawn until well past dusk, its powerful halogen lights cutting swathes through the night. He was a man running from a shadow that was growing faster than he could move. My own operation was small enough to feel the drought, but not break from it. My rented 100 acres yielded poorly, but my costs were next to nothing. The old Massey, with its simple Perkins diesel, sipped fuel compared to Sterling's turbocharged monster. When a bearing went out on the main separator shaft, it cost me $12 at the parts store and a Saturday afternoon with my wrenches to fix. I was still doing custom work, and my list of clients was growing. They were men like me, small operators who couldn't afford the new iron and were now terrified of the bankers who had sold it to them. The turning point came in October, during a miserable, wet harvest. The drought had broken with a vengeance, and the fields turned to a thick, greasy mud. It was the kind of harvest that tests men and machines to their limits. I was finishing up a field of soybeans for the Miller brothers when I saw it. Sterling's massive IH 1480 was sitting motionless in the middle of his home quarter, tilted at a slight angle in the mud. For 2 days, it didn't move. On the third day, I saw the dealer's service truck out there, a gleaming white pickup that looked impossibly clean against the muddy field. Later that week, I ran into one of the Miller boys at the diner. "You hear about Sterling?" he asked, sliding into the booth across from me. I shook my head. "That big new combine of his is down for the count. The main hydraulic pump went out. It's the one that runs the rotor, the header, everything. It's a special order part from Germany. Dealer told him it'll be 3 weeks, best case. 3 weeks. His corn is standing in the mud, rotting on the stalk." My mind flashed to the guts of my own machine. The Massey didn't have a central hydraulic pump. Its separator was driven by a series of heavy belts and chains. The header lift was a simple, independent pump. If one system failed, the others kept working. It was inefficient, old-fashioned, and beautifully simple. It was fixable with tools you could hold in your hand, not a diagnostic computer. Sterling's state-of-the-art machine, his symbol of progress and superiority, had been sidelined by a single, complex part he couldn't get. His entire harvest, the one he needed to make the ballooning payments on his loans, was held hostage by a supply chain that stretched halfway around the world. I kept working. The lighter Massey, with its narrower tires, could navigate the muddy spots Sterling's machine would have sunk in. I worked my own fields, then the Millers', then Old Man Hemphill's. The clatter of my old combine became a familiar sound across the township, a steady, dependable rhythm in a world that was starting to come apart. One evening, as a cold rain began to fall, I was driving home past Sterling's farm. The lights were on in his machine shed. I slowed my truck and saw him standing there, silhouetted against the open door. He was just staring at his silent, mud-caked combine, a wrench hanging uselessly from his hand. The prophet of the New Age was helpless, his faith shattered by the failure of his own complex gods of steel and hydraulics. For the first time, I didn't feel any resentment towards him. I just felt a profound and chilling pity. The cracks in his empire were showing, and the whole rotten structure was about to come crashing down. By 1982, the farm crisis was no longer a whisper. It was a screaming, public agony. The television news ran nightly stories about foreclosure auctions, families who had worked the same land for generations being forced off by sheriffs. The price of corn had collapsed to under $2 a bushel, while interest rates peaked at over 20%. It was a mathematical impossibility. You couldn't make a payment on a $3,000 an acre farm by selling $2 corn, not when the bank was charging you 20% interest on the loan. The numbers that had seemed so intoxicating just a few years before had become a death sentence. The community changed. The easy camaraderie at the diner evaporated, replaced by a tense, fearful silence. Men who used to talk about crop yields and football now stared into their coffee cups, their faces etched with the lines of sleepless nights. Every farm sale notice tacked to the board at the co-op felt like another obituary. Richard Sterling was one of the first to fall, and he fell the hardest. His entire operation was a monument to leverage. He had used the inflated value of his land to borrow more, to buy more land, to buy bigger equipment. When the land values crashed, his net worth evaporated overnight. He wasn't just broke, he was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to a bank that was now fighting for its own survival. His auction was scheduled for a bitter cold Saturday in March of '83. The sky was the color of lead, and a sharp wind cut across the frozen fields. I went. I had to. I parked my old truck down the road and stood at the back of the crowd, just as I had at that auction 7 years earlier. But this time the feeling was different. It wasn't my ghost I was seeing. It was his. The scene was a grim mirror image of his glory days. The massive Steiger Panther tractor, which he had paraded through town like a conquering hero, looked sad and abandoned, a thin film of ice coating its green paint. The 24-row planter, his pride and joy, sat with its wings folded, useless. And there, near the end of the line, was the International Harvester, 14080. It had been repaired, but it hadn't run a full season since. It was too big, too heavy, too thirsty for the new reality. Sterling was there, standing beside his wife near the farmhouse. He looked like a ghost. His face was pale and drawn, his shoulders slumped in a suit that now seemed too big for him. He avoided eye contact, staring at a fixed point on the horizon as the auctioneer, the same man, Miller, who had sold me the Massey, began to dismantle his life, piece by piece. The bidding was sparse, almost funereal. The big equipment went for pennies on the dollar. A finance man from the bank would make a token bid to establish a floor price, and then a speculator from out of state would pick it up for a fraction of its original cost. These weren't farmers buying equipment to use. These were vultures picking the bones. My survival was quiet, almost invisible. While others were going bankrupt, I was making a living. My little 100 acres, combined with the 200 I was now custom farming for neighbors, was enough. With no debt, my income, though modest, was my own. The money I made went into my pocket, not to a bank in Des Moines. I paid my rent, bought my groceries, and put a little aside. In the wreckage of the farm economy, I was solvent. My father's philosophy, the one Sterling and the others had mocked, had become my salvation. The old Massey 300 wasn't just a combine, it was my fortress. Every bolt and bearing I had replaced, every gallon of fuel it burned, was a testament to a different kind of wealth, one that couldn't be wiped out by a change in the prime rate. As the auctioneer worked his way down the line, I watched as Sterling's empire was sold for less than the value of one of his operating loans. He had gotten big, and now he was getting out, just not in the way he had planned. He was a cautionary tale, a living symbol of an era of misplaced faith. And as I stood there in the bitter wind, I felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness for what had been lost. The auctioneer finally reached the combine. "All right, folks," he said, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm. "Here we have an international 1480 axial flow. She needs some work, but it's a lot of machine for the money. What am I bid?" Silence. The wind whistled around the big red machine. In this new world, it was an albatross. No one could afford to run it, let alone fix it when it broke. "Let's start it at 5,000, the auctioneer pleaded. 5,000 for $100,000 combine." More silence. The finance man from the bank just shook his head. It wasn't even worth their while to repossess. "Give me 1,000, the auctioneer said, his voice desperate. $1,000. We're selling it for scrap value here." My hand went up. It was just a slight movement, a twitch of my fingers, but the auctioneer saw it. "I've got 1,000 from Jed Stone," he bellowed, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Do I hear 1250? The crowd turned to look at me. This time there were no snickers, no whispers of mockery. There was just a quiet, stunned respect. Richard Sterling looked over, his eyes meeting mine for the first time that day. In them, I saw not hatred or anger, but a hollowed-out emptiness. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "Of course, it should be you." "Sold," the gavel cracked, "for $1,000 to Jed Stone." I had just bought Richard Sterling's dream for the price of a used car. I didn't know what I would do with it. Maybe I'd get it running. Maybe I'd part it out. But as I walked to the clerk's trailer to pay my bill, in cash, I knew it was more than just a machine. It was a bookend. It was the final, quiet punctuation mark on a long and painful chapter in the life of our community. The age of horsepower and hydraulics was over. The age of survival had begun. The years that followed the crash were lean and quiet. The frantic energy of the 70s was gone, replaced by a hard-won caution. The flashy new pickups disappeared from the roads, replaced by older, dented models that were kept running with baling wire and ingenuity. Farming became less about expansion and more about endurance. The men who survived were the ones who knew how to weld, how to rebuild an engine, how to make do. They were men like my father. My reputation in the county underwent a slow, seismic shift. I was no longer Jed Stone, the fool who bought a junk combine. I was Jed Stone, the man who saw the storm coming. The old-timers at the diner would nod to me when I came in, pulling out a chair for me at their table. They'd ask my opinion on the price of beans or whether the rain would hold off. They didn't talk about my success in terms of acres or bushels, but in a more fundamental language. "Jed's got his head on straight," they'd say. "He owes no man." It was the highest compliment they could pay. I never did get the big international combine running. I parked it in the back of the barn, a silent red monument to a bygone era. I took a few parts off it now and then, a good hydraulic cylinder, a heavy-duty bearing, to keep the old Massey going. Its true value was as a reminder. In the spring of '85, the bank that held the note on my family's old farm finally went under, taken over by federal regulators. Its assets, including the farmland it had foreclosed on, were being sold off to settle its debts. One morning, a notice appeared in the paper for a sealed bid auction on a number of parcels. One of them was the original 80 acres my great-grandfather had homesteaded, the piece with the old barn and the gentle slope down to the creek. It was the heart of the Stone farm. I spent a week poring over my finances. My custom work had been steady, and I had been careful with my money, tucking it away in a coffee can buried under a loose floorboard in the farmhouse. It wasn't a lot, but land was cheap again. I put in a bid that was fair, but not extravagant. It was every penny I had in the world. 2 weeks later, a letter came. My hands trembled as I opened it. My bid had been accepted. The land was mine. Mine. I walked out to the edge of my rented property and looked across the fence row at the fields that were once again my own. I wasn't a tenant anymore. I was a landowner. I fell to my knees and pressed my hands into the rich black soil, the dirt my father and his father had worked. There were no witnesses, no applause. It was a quiet, solitary vindication that was more profound than any public victory. A few months after that, I was at the co-op, loading sacks of seed corn into the back of my truck. A man came over to help me. He was thinner than I remembered, and his hands, though still soft, were calloused now. It was Richard Sterling. He'd taken a job there, doing manual labor for an hourly wage. "Heard you bought back your home place, Jed," he said, his voice quiet, without a trace of his old arrogance. "Just the home 80, I said. "It's a start." He nodded, hoisting a bag onto his shoulder. "You earned it. You were right all along. I was a fool." "We were all caught up in it, Rich," I said, and I meant it. The times were crazy. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a weary gratitude. "If you ever need a hand during harvest," he said, "I mean, a hired hand, let me know. I know how to run a combine." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. We stood there for a moment in an awkward silence, two men who had been on opposite sides of a war that had left them both scarred. The past was a landscape of wreckage between us, but for the first time, it felt like a bridge might be possible. The decade turned. By 1989, the world felt a little more stable. My son, Ben, was 16, with my father's eyes and my own love for the smell of diesel and grease. I had managed to buy back another 40 acres adjoining the home place. We weren't rich, but we were building something real, something that would last. One Saturday afternoon, we were in the barn, giving the Massey its pre-harvest checkup. Ben was underneath, greasing the fittings, while I was up top, checking the tension on the main separator belt. "Dad," he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous machine. "Why do we keep running this old thing? We could afford a newer one now. A better one." I stopped turning my wrench and looked around the barn. My gaze fell on the hulking shape of the International Harvester in the far corner, covered in a thick blanket of dust. I thought of Sterling, of the auctions, of the desperate fear in the eyes of my neighbors. I thought of the $500 that had been my entire world. I climbed down from the combine and wiped my greasy hands on a rag. I walked over to Ben and put a hand on his shoulder. "We keep it because it reminds us," I said. "It's not what you own that makes you a farmer, son. It's what you owe. This machine," I patted the faded red flank of the Massey, "owes nothing to anybody. It taught me that the goal isn't to be the biggest. The goal is to be the last one standing." Ben looked from the old Massey to me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of true understanding in his young eyes. He picked up a wrench and turned back to his work. The sound of steel on steel echoed in the quiet barn, a familiar and comforting rhythm. It was the sound of a lesson being learned, a legacy being passed, a harvest that would never truly end.